April 1945. Somewhere in the English countryside, a row of wooden barracks stands silent under a cold spring sky. Inside, 37 women sit on narrow bunks. Their uniforms are torn. Their faces are pale. They do not speak. These are not British women. They are German. Prisoners of war. For weeks they have waited for punishment, waited for revenge, waited for the cruelty they were told would come. They had been taught that the enemy shows no mercy, that surrender means suffering, that capture means the end. But tonight, something will happen that none of them expected. Something so small, so simple, that it will break them completely, not with violence, not with interrogation, not with fear, but with kindness. By morning, many of them will have cried through the entire night, not from pain, but from something far more powerful, something they thought no longer existed in this war. This is the story of one gesture, one moment, one man, and the night that changed everything for 37 enemy prisoners who had forgotten what it meant to be treated like human beings. By April 1945, the war in Europe was dying. Nazi Germany was collapsing from all sides. Soviet forces crushed eastward through Berlin. American and British armies swept across the Rhine. Cities burned, armies scattered, millions fled, and millions more surrendered. Among them were not just soldiers. There were nurses, radio operators, clerks, cooks, factory workers, women who had served the German war machine in dozens of roles far from the front lines, women who wore uniforms, women who had believed in victory, women who now found themselves prisoners in a foreign land. The British had been taking German POWs since 1939. By 1945, there were hundreds of thousands held across England and Scotland. Most were men, soldiers captured in North Africa, Italy, France. They were housed in camps built quickly from wood and wire, fed basic rations, put to work on farms or construction sites, treated for the most part according to the Geneva Convention. But the women were different. Female prisoners were rare. They arrived in small groups during the final months. Most had worked as auxiliaries, Nachrichtenhelferinnen, communication helpers, Stabshelferinnen, staff assistants. Some were Luftwaffe personnel. Others had served in anti-aircraft units or military hospitals. A few were nurses captured during the retreat. They were not combatants, but they were enemy, and no one quite knew what to do with them. The British government decided quickly. These women would be interned separately, guarded carefully, questioned if necessary, but not mistreated. Orders were clear. Follow the rules. No abuse. No exceptions. Still, the camps were cold. The food was plain, and the fear was everywhere. The camp where these 37 women were held sat on the edge of a quiet farming town. It had once been a military training site. Now it was surrounded by barbed wire and wooden watchtowers. Guards patrolled the perimeter. Searchlights swept the grounds at night. Inside, the women lived in uncertainty. They slept in unheated barracks. They woke to roll calls. They worked in the laundry or kitchen under supervision. They were not beaten. They were not starved. But they were isolated, cut off from news, cut off from families, cut off from any sense of what would happen next. Most of all, they were terrified. For years, Nazi propaganda had told them stories of what the Allies did to German prisoners, stories of torture, humiliation, execution. The women had heard these tales since childhood. They had been warned never to surrender, never to trust the enemy, and now they were in enemy hands. Every footstep outside the barracks made them flinch. Every order from a guard felt like the beginning of something worse. They expected cruelty. They expected punishment. They expected to pay for the sins of their country. But it did not come. Instead, there was only silence. Routine. Cold porridge in the mornings. Watery soup at night. Work details. Boredom. And the endless gnawing fear that the real punishment was still waiting. The guards were mostly older men, veterans of the First World War, factory workers, farmers, men too old or too injured to fight on the front lines. They did their jobs without emotion. They kept order. They followed the rules. Among them was the camp cook. His name is lost to history. No records survive with his full identity. But the women would remember him, not because of what he said. He barely spoke to them at all. But because of what he did. One evening in late April, as the war entered its final days, this cook made a decision. A small one, a quiet one, something that broke no rules, something that cost him almost nothing. But to the women in that camp, it would mean everything. The women's perspective. They were not monsters. That is important to understand. These 37 women were not SS officers. They were not concentration camp guards. They had not pulled triggers or signed death warrants. Most had joined the auxiliary services because they had no choice, because the Reich demanded it, because refusal meant suspicion, punishment, danger to their families. Some had been clerks typing reports in quiet offices. Others operated radios, passing messages between units. A few had worked in military hospitals, changing bandages and holding the hands of dying boys. They had done their jobs. They had believed what they were told. And when the war turned, they had run, but running had not saved them. Now they sat in a foreign country, surrounded by foreign voices, wearing the uniforms of a defeated army. They ranged in age from 18 to 40. Some were mothers. Some had left children behind in the chaos of evacuation. Others had lost brothers, fathers, husbands to the fighting. A few had watched their hometowns burn under Allied bombs. They carried guilt, grief, shame, and fear. Fear was the heaviest burden. They had been told that British soldiers were savages, that they showed no mercy to women, that female prisoners would be used, abused, discarded. The propaganda had been relentless, and now, trapped behind wire, they waited for it to come true. Every night, they lay awake, listening for the sound of boots, for the doors to open, for the moment when the pretense of decency would end and the real treatment would begin. But the nights stayed quiet. The guards did not harm them. The officers did not interrogate them with violence. The food was plain, but it came. The barracks were cold, but they had roofs. Days passed, then weeks, and slowly the fear began to twist into something else. Confusion. Why were they not being punished? Why had no one hurt them? Were the British waiting for something? Was this all a trick? A trap? Would the punishment come later, once their guard was down? They did not trust kindness. Kindness had been beaten out of them by years of war, by propaganda, by loss. They had learned to expect the worst, to assume cruelty, to protect themselves by feeling nothing. So when the guards treated them with cold professionalism, they felt nothing. When the officers spoke to them without hatred, they felt nothing. When the work details were fair and the rations were adequate, they felt nothing. They had built walls inside themselves, walls thick enough to survive whatever was coming, But those walls were about to crack. Not from violence, not from fear, from something far more dangerous. The British guards and staff, the men who guarded the camp, were tired. Tired of war, tired of duty, tired of watching the years slip by while younger men fought and died across the sea. These were not frontline soldiers. They were the ones left behind, the ones deemed too old, too slow, too broken to carry a rifle into battle. Some had fought in the First War. They had seen the trenches, the mud, the gas, the endless rows of dead. They had come home with scars, inside and out, and now they were back in uniform again, guarding an enemy they no longer hated with the fire they once had. Others were factory workers, farmers, men with families in nearby towns. They took the job because it paid, because it kept them useful, because someone had to do it. Their orders were simple: keep the prisoners secure, keep them fed, keep them alive, follow the Geneva Convention. No violence, no abuse, no exceptions. Most of them followed those orders without thinking. They unlocked doors. They counted heads. They served meals. They walked the fence line. They did not speak to the prisoners unless necessary. They did not see them as individuals. They saw them as a duty, a responsibility, a task to complete before going home. But one man saw them differently. The cook. He worked in the camp kitchen from dawn until evening. He prepared the meals, boiled the potatoes, ladled the soup, sliced the bread, day after day, week after week. The same routine, the same tasteless rations, the same metal trays carried into the barracks by guards who barely looked at the faces waiting to be fed. He had been doing this job for months. He had watched the male prisoners come and go, German soldiers who joked with each other, who sang songs in their barracks, who worked the fields and seemed, in some strange way, almost content. War was over for them. They had survived. They would go home eventually, but the women were different. He noticed it immediately when they arrived. The silence, the way they kept their eyes down, the way they flinched when a guard's voice rose even slightly, the way they ate without tasting, without speaking, without any sign of life behind their eyes. He had a daughter. She was 16, safe at home, but she was the same age as some of these women, and when he looked at them, he could not help but think of her. What if the war had gone differently? What if Britain had lost? What if his daughter had been the one sitting in a camp somewhere in Germany, terrified and alone? He did not speak his thoughts aloud. The other guards would not have understood. To them, these were Germans, the enemy, the people who had bombed London, who had killed their friends, their brothers, their sons. But to the cook, they were just frightened young women, and he knew something the others did not seem to notice. It was almost the end of April. The war was nearly over. The newspapers said so. The radio said so. Everyone knew it. And in 2 days, it would be May. May meant something. Something the guards had not considered. Something the officers had not thought to mention. May 1st was a holiday in Germany. My fire tag. A celebration of spring, of renewal, of hope. But these women would spend it behind wire, in silence, in fear, with nothing to mark the day, nothing to remind them that the world still turned, that seasons still changed, that life still existed somewhere beyond the war. The cook thought about this as he worked. He stirred the soup, he sliced the bread, and he made a decision, a small one, a quiet one, but one that would change everything. April 30th, 1945. Evening, the cook stayed late in the kitchen after the other staff had gone. He worked alone under the dim electric light. The stove was still warm. The pots had been scrubbed. The leftover bread was wrapped and stored, but he was not finished. He pulled out flour, sugar, a small tin of butter he had been saving, eggs from the camp's henhouse, a handful of dried fruit, ingredients that were precious, rationed, meant to last. He measured carefully, mixed the dough, shaped it with his hands, slid the trays into the oven, and he baked. For hours he worked. The smell filled the kitchen. Sweet, warm. The smell of something that had not existed in that camp before. The smell of home. By the time he finished, it was past midnight. May 1st had arrived. He wrapped the small cakes carefully. 37 of them, one for each woman. They were simple, plain by peacetime standards. But in a world of watery soup and stale bread, they were miracles. He carried them to the women's barracks himself. The guard at the door looked surprised. It was late, past curfew, but the cook nodded, said a few quiet words, and the guard stepped aside. Inside, the barracks were dark. The women were not asleep. They never truly slept. They lay on their bunks, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind. Waiting for morning, the cook stepped inside. He did not speak. He simply moved from bunk to bunk, placing a small wrapped cake on each woman's blanket. One by one, they sat up, confused, wary, afraid to move, afraid to hope. He finished his rounds, stood at the door, and then, in broken German, he said the only words he would speak that night. Frohen 1. Mai. Happy May Day. And then he left. For a long moment, no one moved. 37 women sat frozen in the darkness, staring at the small parcels resting on their laps. They did not understand. They did not trust it. This had to be a trick, a test, a trap. One woman slowly unwrapped hers. The paper crinkled in the silence. She looked down at the small cake. Plain, still faintly warm. She lifted it carefully, smelled it, and then she broke. The sob came from somewhere deep inside her, a sound she had been holding back for months, for years, a sound that had no words, only grief, only relief, only the overwhelming, crushing weight of realizing that someone had seen her, had thought of her, had remembered she was human. Another woman unwrapped hers. Her hands were shaking. She bit into the cake, tasted sugar, tasted butter, tasted something her mother used to bake when she was a child, when the world was safe, when there was no war. She began to cry. Then another, and another. Within minutes, the entire barracks was weeping. Not quietly, not carefully. These were the cries of women who had been holding everything inside for too long. Women who had expected punishment and received kindness. Women who had built walls to protect themselves, and those walls had just shattered. Some cried into their hands. Others pressed their faces into their thin pillows. A few held each other, strangers becoming sisters in their shared breaking. They cried because they had been so afraid, because they had believed they were hated, because they had thought the world had no mercy left. And then a man they did not know, a man whose country they had fought against, had baked them cakes, had remembered a holiday, had treated them like daughters, like humans, like people who mattered. It was not the cake itself. It was what it meant. It meant they had not been forgotten. It meant kindness still existed. It meant that even in war, even between enemies, there were still people who saw suffering and chose compassion. The guard outside the barracks heard the crying. He stood at his post, unsure what to do. He did not go inside. He did not report it. He simply stood there, listening to the sound of 37 women weeping through the night. By dawn, their eyes were red. Their voices were hoarse. The cakes were gone. But something inside them had changed. The walls were gone. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled them. For the first time since their capture, they felt something other than terror. They felt seen. The next morning, the camp felt different. The guards noticed it immediately. The women stood straighter at roll call. They looked up instead of down. When orders were given, they responded, not with fear, not with silence, but with something that resembled calm. One of the older guards whispered to another, "What happened in there last night?" No one answered, but everyone knew. Word had spread quietly among the staff. The cook had done something small, something unauthorized. But no one reported him. No officer reprimanded him, because even they understood. In the days that followed, the women began to speak. Not much, not loudly, but they spoke to each other. They exchanged names, shared stories. A few even smiled, small, fragile smiles, but real. They no longer moved through the camp like ghosts. They worked with purpose. They asked questions. They began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they would survive this. That survival did not mean suffering, that the end of the war might bring something other than punishment. The cook returned to his routine. He did not bake again. There were no more cakes, no more gestures. He went back to boiling potatoes and ladling soup. But when he passed the women's barracks, some of them nodded. A quiet acknowledgement, a thank you that needed no words. One woman, a former nurse named Greta, approached him a week later during a work detail. She spoke in halting English. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you do that?" The cook looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply, "Because you were far from home." That was all. But it was enough. By mid-May, Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The camp received new orders. The women would be processed, interviewed, eventually sent home, or to camps where they would wait for repatriation. The future was still uncertain, but it was no longer terrifying. In the months that followed, the 37 women were slowly released. Some went home to cities that no longer existed. Others searched for families scattered across a broken Germany. A few stayed in Allied zones, working as translators or nurses in refugee camps. They returned to a country divided, occupied, ashamed. But they carried something with them, a memory, a moment, a night when they had cried not from fear, but from kindness. Years later, some of them would tell their children, their grandchildren, about the British camp, about the cold barracks, about the fear that had consumed them, and about the cook who had baked them cakes on May Day. The story spread quietly, not in newspapers, not in history books, but in letters, in conversations, in the private memories of women who had lived through something extraordinary. One woman, decades later, wrote in a journal that was discovered after her death. She described that night in detail. The sound of the paper unwrapping, the taste of the cake, the way her heart had broken open. She wrote, "I had forgotten what it felt like to be treated with gentleness. That man gave us back our humanity. He did not have to, but he did." Another woman, interviewed in the 1980s for a small regional documentary about POW camps, spoke about it briefly. Her voice cracked as she remembered. "We thought we were monsters," she said. "We thought the world saw us as evil. But that cook saw us as people. He saw us as daughters. That changed everything." The cook himself never spoke of it publicly. His name faded from memory. No medals were given. No recognition came. He returned to civilian life after the war, went back to his kitchen, raised his family, and likely never knew the full weight of what he had done. But the women knew. They carried it with them for the rest of their lives. That single act of kindness in a world of cruelty. That small gesture that had cost so little and meant so much. It did not erase the war. It did not undo the suffering. It did not change the fact that millions had died, that cities had burned, that families had been destroyed. But it proved something important, that even in the darkest moments, humanity could survive. That even between enemies, compassion was possible. That even when the world demanded hatred, some people chose kindness instead. War teaches us to see enemies. It divides the world into sides, into uniforms, into us and them. It tells us that the people on the other side are different, dangerous, less than human. It builds walls in our hearts and asks us to keep them strong. But every so often, someone refuses. Someone looks across the divide and sees not a uniform, but a person. Not an enemy, but a daughter, a sister, a frightened human being far from home. The cook in that British camp did not end the war. He did not change history. He did not save lives on the battlefield or negotiate peace treaties. He simply baked 37 small cakes and gave them to 37 frightened women on a spring night in 1945. It was a small act, so small that it barely appears in the records, so quiet that most of the world never knew it happened. But to those women, it was everything. It reminded them that kindness had not died, that the world still held gentleness, that even in the worst chapters of human history, there were still people who chose compassion over cruelty, who chose to see the person instead of the enemy. This is not a story about heroes. It is a story about decency, about the quiet courage it takes to treat others with humanity when the world tells you not to, about the power of small gestures in a time of great darkness. We remember the battles, the strategies, the leaders, and the turning points. We remember the machines and the movements and the dates that changed the world. But sometimes, the most important moments are the ones that happen in silence, in a cold barracks, on a night when 37 women received a kindness they did not expect and would never forget. Because wars are fought with weapons, but humanity survives through gestures like this, through the people who refuse to let hatred win, who choose, even in small ways, to remind us what it means to be human. That British cook is gone now, his name lost, his face forgotten, but his kindness remains, carried forward in the memories of the women who cried that night, passed down to their children, their grandchildren, whispered across generations as a reminder that even in war, even between enemies, even in the darkest hours, love can still break through. One small cake at a time.